Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Dr. Joanna Moncrieff. Dr. Moncrieff is a psychiatrist, professor, author, and one of the most fearless and influential thinkers in modern mental health. For over 30 years, Dr. Moncrieff has stood at the center of psychiatry, not to defend it blindly, but to question its foundations, to hold it accountable, and to tell the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. She is a professor of critical and social psychiatry at University College London, a consultant psychiatrist in the UK's National Health Service, and the co-founder of the Critical Psychiatry Network, a global collective of psychiatrists challenging the chemical narratives that have shaped and distorted our understanding of mental illness for decades. For years, we've been told that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance and that our despair is a disorder and that our suffering is a malfunction. But Dr. Moncrieff has spent her life asking the question most were too afraid to ask. What if we got this wrong? In 2022, she co-authored one of the most important studies in psychiatric history, a landmark meta-analysis that dismantled the serotonin theory on depression, revealing that the scientific basis for one of the most widely accepted explanations for mental illness simply doesn't exist. Her latest book, Chemically Imbalanced, goes further. It doesn't just challenge the pharmaceutical narrative, it exposes the social, political, and economic systems that have medicalized emotion and pathologized pain. And it is a call to reclaim our right to feel, to grieve, to question, and to be human without shame or sedation. Beyond the research and the resistance, Dr. Moncrieff is much more. She's a doctor who has sat across from real people in real pain and never stopped asking what was missing from the way we care. A woman who has walked through the noise of a multi-billion-dollar industry and emerged with her conscience and her courage intact, with no intent to burn it down, but to build something better. So, Dr. Moncrieff, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you, Jalon. Thank you for that lovely introduction.
It's my pleasure. And also, I did give a brief introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to who and where you are today?
Yes, of course. I'm a psychiatrist. That means I trained, I did medicine, became a medical doctor, and then I specialized in psychiatry. I did all that in the UK, and since I qualified, I've worked as a psychiatrist in the National Health Service in the UK, mainly in London. And I currently also hold an academic position at the University College London. So that means that alongside my clinical work with patients, I also do teaching and research work.
Thank you for sharing that. What you do is quite remarkable, challenging the system and asking difficult questions. So I wanted to ask you, what keeps you grounded in your mission, even when the pressure to stay silent might be a real thing?
So two things I would say. The fact that I know that there are many other professionals out there who share my point of view. There always have been, but now, in these days of the internet, it's easier to link up and identify people. So that's really empowering. It's not just me saying this on my own. There are actually hundreds, if not thousands, of professionals out there who are putting out a similar message, who have similar views and similar approaches. And then the other thing, of course, is patients, my patients, but patients, people. When I say patients, I mean people who are, in mental distress, who are seeking help in one way or another. And many people come to me and say that they feel they've been misled by the system, by the standard services, and that they welcome someone who gives them information about the evidence base for our conventional interventions like antidepressants and other sorts of drugs, and it enables them to think differently about their problems.
Thank you for sharing that. I think if there's real evidence, like it can't be ignored. And so to ignore evidence would be, I mean, in my opinion, one of the greatest disservices we could do to patients and to people who need us. Um, and I think that leads into another question I want to ask is what does it really mean to treat people and not disorders?
So that's a really good question that gets to the heart of the
Mhm.
problem. One of the problems with our mental health system at the moment, I would say, is that we've modeled it on general medicine. And so we've got this idea that individuals have disorders. So, person X has depression, person Y has anxiety, person Z has depression as well. And everyone who has depression has the same thing. Essentially, they have
Mhm.
a thing called depression that's inside them somewhere. And if we want to help someone who has depression, we have to treat the depression. We have to treat this thing that they have. And what I've been saying, and many other people have been saying for years now, is that this is completely the wrong way to think about mental health problems. Mental health problems, like depression, are experiences that individuals have and ways that individuals respond to the world. And you can't separate them from the individual that is having the experiences. So what we really need to think of is a person who is going through, a period of depression, who is experiencing, difficult emotions. Um, and if we do it like that, if we think of it like that, we can then understand that what we need to look at is that person's context. We need to think about, what are they responding to? Why are they feeling these, experiencing these difficult, distressing emotions? What is going wrong in their life? What isn't right? What could be changed? What might have happened in the past that has influenced them? It leads us naturally to look at the whole person and try and understand the whole person rather than focusing on this supposed disease-like disorder that they supposedly have.
Mm. While you were saying that, I was trying to think of an analogy that would allow somebody to understand that better. And I got the mental picture of someone having spikes in their driveway, and every time they back over them, they get a flat tire. And instead of addressing the spikes, they just keep changing the tire.
Right. Yes. That's a really good way to think of it. Yes.
Because you never address the real problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Um, yeah. When you look back at your early life, your family system, the way you were raised, what kind of messages did you absorb about emotion, struggle, and what it meant to be well?
So it was a different era, and we didn't think of mental health problems in the same way. And I think things have changed both for the better and for the worse since that time. So at that time, I think we mostly understood emotional problems as reactions to things that were happening in people's lives, So if someone was depressed, you didn't ask, you didn't think, oh gosh, what's going on in their brain? You thought, what's going on in their life, have they got divorced? Have they just lost their job? Um, and I think that was a more healthy way to think about emotional problems. On the other hand, there was also, an attitude of a stiff upper lip, especially in the UK. I mean, I think it probably wasn't quite so marked in other places, especially the US. But, a stiff upper lip so that you, if you had emotional problems, you didn't talk about them. You just
Mhm.
got on and you endured. And in that respect, I think things have improved. The fact that people feel that they can talk about their emotional problems and that there are people out there that can support them, and that it's okay to ask for help. I mean, obviously that those developments I think are really positive ones. Um, so, so I suppose I yes, that I've seen these both positive and negative changes in the way that we think about mental health problems over the course of my lifetime.
Why do you think it was so taboo and people had such a stiff upper lip when it came to talking about emotions? What was it that made it so difficult?
Gosh, that's a good question, and I don't know that I have a brilliant answer to it. I mean, I suppose it goes back to the fact that, if we go back 200 or 300 years, life was a real battle for survival for the majority of the population. It was about whether you could put food on the table to feed your family, whether you could get a roof over your head. And so there probably wasn't a lot of time for anyone to think about their emotional state. And it's only as the majority of the population overall populations have become, materially more comfortable, and there's more of a safety net that people have had the, headspace really to be able to think about the sort of emotional state they're in. So I think that's one thing. I think especially in Britain, social attitudes were very conservative, and driven by sort of upper class aristocratic values, which were conservative, which emphasized
Survival, probably.
maintaining the status quo. And not complaining.
I mean, I think if all you're focusing on is surviving, putting food on the table, putting a roof on your head, and talking about your feelings and emotions doesn't allow for that to happen the way it needs to, then they go on the back burner.
Yeah. I think that's what's happened. But also, as I say, everyone's values were coloured by the values of the aristocracy, and they were very conservative. And there was a culture of not complaining, because complaining was going to threaten their position in society.
That makes sense. What kind of relationship did you have with your mind growing up, and how do you think that shaped the way you approach medicine later?
So I don't know whether I'm answering your question, but so tell me to stop if I'm not. But I had periods of feeling quite low and depressed as a teenager, as I think many people do. But of course, when you're going through that, you think you're the only person that's going through it. And I was aware that one response to that might be to take me to a doctor and put me on pills. And I desperately didn't want that to happen. And I think it partly didn't happen because my parents weren't those sorts of people, and because I was so resistant. And for a long time, even though I came out of that period of depression, for a long time I saw myself as someone who was vulnerable to depression and might slip back into it. And it took many years really for me to feel feel confident that I wouldn't get that bad again, and that I had the resources to cope if I did. And I think this is a lesson that maybe isn't apparent enough to people nowadays, because we have this idea that, if you have an emotional problem, you need to go to your doctor, and many people end up on medication for that. I think, therefore, people don't necessarily learn that actually you can get through these episodes, and eventually you will develop the resources to cope with them. It may, may take some help and some examination and some thought and some effort, but that it is possible to become more robust and to become more confident and to get better at dealing with your emotions.
Thank you for sharing that personal early life experience. Was that something that you can look back on now and understand why and where the depression came from? And because you said you felt like you were always vulnerable to slip back into it, how does that, I guess, contrast to what you know now and how you live?
Yeah, so I would say that I was aware at the time why I was feeling depressed, but I was lonely. I was in a school I didn't like,
Mm.
didn't really have friends who were like-minded, um, but I didn't know what to do about it. I did change my school, and it did I did eventually feel better, but it took quite a while. Um, I suppose it took a while to make new friends and settle in and all that sort of thing. Um, and I think that's similar to many people's experience. You may know why you feel depressed. You may do something about, you may change it, but it doesn't it doesn't lift the depression immediately. It's not as if it's an immediate solution. Um, and you have to stick with it and work at it very often for those changes to really have benefit. Um, and what did it teach me? As I say, I think it taught me that we often don't realize how resilient we are. We can see ourselves as more fragile than we actually are, and be super anxious about the idea that we might slip back into depression, whereas actually it's quite likely that if we've been through an episode of emotional distress and come out of it, it's quite likely that actually we've learned quite a lot, and that that will help us in the future to fend off those feelings if we're in a similar situation.
Sure. I think one of the things about your career and what you do is that you've spent a very long time challenging narratives and questioning things. Was that something that was always a part of you? Like even as a child, did you question things that didn't make sense to you? And do you think that if you did, that younger part of you is still alive in you today and has made your career flourish?
Um, I've certainly been a questioning person at least since I was an adolescent. I was reading this
Mm.
sorts of um, seditious literature, shall we put it, when I was a teenager. Um, and from the moment I went into medicine, I was interested in people who had critiqued medicine in general and psychiatry in particular. So I was reading um, famous authors like Ivan Illich, who wrote a very interesting critique of medicine, suggesting that we're over medicalizing life in general, and that is harmful to us in some ways. And people like Thomas Saz and R.D. Laing, who were critics of psychiatry. So so yes, I suppose I've always been questioning things, but then when I started training as a psychiatrist, and meeting patients for the first time, and particularly working in those big old mental hospitals, the asylums that were just about still open when I went into psychiatric training, that's when I started to question the conventional narrative of psychiatry, and particularly psychiatric drug treatment, even more, um, because what we were being told in textbooks is that we had these, super sophisticated drugs that worked by targeting brain processes and mechanisms, and got people better and got people out of hospital, and they were, restored back to normal. And what I was seeing were wards full of people who were sedated, who were zombified,
Mm.
who were shuffling round at that time on very high doses of these drugs. Thankfully, now we usually use lower doses, and they're not, I don't think they're quite as debilitating, but for that reason. Um, but so that experience sort of opened my eyes to the difference between the way the official story is told and what you actually see in front of you.
What did that tension feel like? Um, I guess seeing what was mainstream and then realizing that it may have not necessarily been the best way for people to be treated. Like you said, you saw people who were zombified because they were on these high doses. And so now you're learning these things and you're realizing, okay, well, maybe that's not the best way. But what was there, like a tug and pull there for you?
So I had to do psychiatric exams to qualify as a psychiatrist. And I remember feeling as if I was having to shovel all this information into my brain that didn't really make sense in order to regurgitate it for the exams. And thinking, well, at least when I've got them done, then I can put it all aside and get on with actually understanding what's happening to these people and trying to help them in a better way. I actually failed my exams, so I had to retake them. And partly because that process of trying to learn all this stuff that didn't really make sense was so difficult. But the experience of failing was really useful to me because that made me go and look at all the research literature and look at the studies that these claims were based on. And first of all, that was, interesting. And secondly, it gave me ammunition for my views. It helped me to establish my academic career and to make sure that I really knew what I was talking about when I was criticizing the official position on things.
And you've said that your work isn't about being anti-medication; it's more so about being pro-truth, which I love. What personal experiences taught you how dangerous it is when people accept story without questioning it?
Personally, gosh, I mean, just to fill out what you're saying a bit more. So, I'm not against psychiatric medication. What I think, though, is that we don't adequately understand the medication that we use. We don't properly understand what it does and what it doesn't do. We'll be misled into ideas that it does something more sophisticated and targeted than it actually does. And I still think there's a place for some sorts of psychiatric medication in some situations, but I think we need to think much more carefully about what it's doing and what it's achieving that we might welcome, but also all the harmful consequences that it can have. So that's my views on medication. How did I learn about the value of questioning things? Trying to think of an early example, because the example that immediately springs to mind, and we're going off topic a bit, so just tell me if
That's
this is
fine.
not
No.
appropriate or cut it out. But the thing that springs to mind is the pandemic, and the fact that we shut down much of the world's activity on the basis of, not very much evidence about this virus, but then even worse, that we rolled out a huge and often mandatory vaccination campaign on the basis of evidence that I don't think was good enough to justify at least the mandatory vaccine campaign. I'm not saying that the vaccine might not have been justified in some cases, but I think to mandate that lots of young, healthy people should have it was wrong. And that was really shocking to me, to see how policy could be enacted on the basis of bad, weak evidence for basically, I think, political purposes rather than proper scientific or medical benefit.
I don't think you're alone in feeling like that. I know a lot of people feel that same way, especially because if the evidence isn't there, you're rushing to a solution that doesn't really have a foundation in fixing the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, and if you don't really understand what you're doing, if you don't understand a process properly, so like, I suggest we don't really understand what we're doing when we give people psychiatric drugs, or particularly say antidepressants. Then, there are all sorts of harmful consequences down the line that can occur that we're not necessarily looking out for because we haven't really understood the nature of what we're doing. And I think something of that sort also happened in the pandemic.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert in the area, so I probably shouldn't go any further than that. Although I have read quite a lot of the trial literature on the vaccines.
Sure. All right, let's talk about the chemical imbalance theory because for decades, this idea shaped how we define and treat depression. And you co authored a study that challenged it head on. What first made you question this story, and what did you discover as you started to look deeper?
So there were a couple of reasons why I wanted to do this study. The first is that I was aware that the majority of the population thought that it had been scientifically established that depression is or can be caused by a lack of serotonin. And that was really brought home to me. I went and gave a lecture to the German department in in my university. And, the people who came along were professors, lecturers, all, very highly educated people. And they were absolutely shocked when I said that actually, we don't have much evidence for this idea that depression is caused by a lack of serotonin. Um, and then the other reason I wanted to do some research on this was because there were quite a few leading psychiatrists um, who were acknowledging in the press that there wasn't really good evidence for the serotonin theory of depression. And yet there was nowhere in the literature that you could point to that actually substantiated that point of view. So I thought it was important to have somewhere, to have a paper that people could turn to and say, oh, yes, look, this paper gets all the literature on serotonin and depression together and comes to a conclusion. Um, so so I got this little team together, and that's what we did. We identified all the areas of modern research that has looked into whether there are links between serotonin abnormalities and depression. We got the studies together in those different areas, and then we're able to come to a conclusion about the research in each of those different areas. And there were about 6 areas of research that we looked at. And to summarize the conclusion very briefly, none of those areas of research showed consistent or convincing evidence that there was a lack of serotonin in people with depression compared to people without depression, or the research that looked at the links in other ways. For example, there were studies that investigated whether artificially lowering serotonin in the brain could induce depression. And those studies also did not show that you could induce depression using this technique in people who didn't have depression in the first place. So
Wow.
none of the research we looked at showed evidence that serotonin is caused by that depression is caused by a lack of serotonin. But not only that, it didn't even show any convincing evidence of any link between serotonin and depression. And it certainly didn't show any evidence of a causal link because, when you're depressed, there are likely to be changes in your brain chemistry, changes in your biology. You behave differently. Your brain is, there's going to be different levels of activity going on in your brain. You might be just very apathetic and not much activity going on, or you might be very stressed and there's loads of activity going on. So there may be things happening in your brain while you're depressed that are correlates of being depressed, but not causes of being depressed. And really, to demonstrate that something is a cause of depression, you need to show that it's present before the depression starts. And there's really no evidence of that sort concerning the links between serotonin and depression. There is an interesting paper that was published in 2019 that looked at other areas of biological research that had looked at whether there was an abnormality preceding the onset of depression that could be causal. And they also didn't find any evidence of any abnormalities in any biological system that preceded the onset of depression.
That is crazy. I mean, that is a landmark finding. Why do you think that narrative held for so long? Like, who benefited from it, and of course, who paid the price?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. Um, the I think I think that narrative got so popular and has been maintained primarily because of the pharmaceutical industry. So in the early 1990s, late 1980s, early 1990s, when the first SSRI antidepressants were introduced, the pharmaceutical companies that marketed them launched huge promotional campaigns that must have cost millions of dollars, millions of pounds, aimed at persuading people that depression was a medical condition. They ought to go and see their doctor, and they ought to get some sort of medical intervention, which of course would normally be considered to be a drug, an antidepressant drug. And part of those promotional campaigns was to persuade people that depression was caused by a chemical imbalance, and that these new drugs that they had could correct that imbalance. That idea was had initially been formulated by psychiatrists and researchers back in the 1960s, but it had never been demonstrated, despite whole research programs being set up to try and detect abnormalities in brain chemicals in the 1970s and 1980s. These research programs didn't find those abnormalities. So at the time when the pharmaceutical industry retrieved this idea, recruited it for their promotional campaigns, there was, no evidence behind it. And in the subsequent decades, despite attempts to find evidence to support this idea, it hasn't transpired that it is supported as we showed in our review. So I think the main reason that it became so popular and so widely accepted is because of the activities of the pharmaceutical industry. But it's also, I think, influenced by the fact that this idea was a convenient one for the medical profession, or certainly for sections of the medical profession like psychiatrists, who wanted to persuade people that depression is a medical disorder and it's something that should be treated by doctors. And I think also there's been some political influence behind it, because it's an idea that you can see that it's an idea that gets governments off the hook it enables governments to park social problems that may be causing people to feel distressed, anxious, unhappy, insecure, etc. They can say, oh, this is a medical problem. This is to do with people's brain chemicals. This is not because we have policies that are increasing inequality, increasing insecurity, increasing debt, making housing more difficult for people, making employment more competitive and more stressful. So I think there are all those factors behind it, plus probably that, it's just a sort of very simple story. All the pharmaceutical industry put out all these visual illustrations, so now everyone's got these ideas in these sort of images in their heads of molecules and nerve cells and molecules. So I think it was compelling in that way.
It almost sounds like an indoctrination
I
with a
think
purpose.
so. I think it was, and in my book, Chemically Imbalanced, which I published at the beginning of this year, I recount my my research into the Defeat Depression campaign, which was one of these depression awareness campaigns that was run in the early 1990s in the UK, and there were similar campaigns run in the US and in Australia and other parts of the world. And this campaign in the UK was partly run by the Royal College of Psychiatrists and the Royal College of General Practitioners, but it was partly funded by Eli Lilly, the drug company that makes Prozac, which was the first modern SSRI antidepressant. Now, as part of that campaign, they did a survey to see what people thought about depression at the time. And they found that people thought that depression was caused by social problems like unemployment, like divorce, like debt, like child abuse. And they also found that people didn't like the idea of taking a drug to deal with their emotional problems because they thought it would just numb them and it might make them dependent. And this campaign was clearly very deliberately set up to override those ideas and to replace them with this, in the mind of the general public, to replace them with this idea that depression is a medical problem caused by some sort of biological abnormality that is correctly addressed with a medical intervention like an antidepressant. So I think it was an exercise in propaganda and deliberate mind changing.
So how do you hold emotionally or even scientifically or ethically when someone says, yes, but antidepressants saved my life?
So I think this is a really important question to address. And there are lots of different responses to it. So lots of people feel that they have benefited from taking antidepressants. That's undoubtedly the case. The trouble is that we know that giving someone an intervention that you tell them is going to be effective, especially if it's coupled with telling them, this idea that they've got a brain abnormality and this drug is going to correct it, does make people feel better in the short term. People might are likely to get a sort of sense of relief of, thank goodness the way I feel is not my fault. And there's a nice, simple solution for it. I just need to take this pill. I don't need to worry and stress about how I'm feeling or what might be the cause of it or how I get myself out of it. Just need to take this pill. Of course, that's a relief. That's going to make you feel better temporarily, or makes many people feel better temporarily. But if you look at the scientific literature, at the scientific research on antidepressants, the research that has set out to try and establish whether they actually have a pharmacological effect that is better than their placebo effect, you find that these studies show that there is a very minimal pharmacological effect at best. So what these studies show is that antidepressants are really barely any different from taking a placebo. The difference is 2 points on a 52-point rating scale, which is almost certainly completely clinically insignificant and not even noticeable for most people. And moreover, that difference is probably also accounted for by the fact that many of the people in these trials, which are meant to be double blind, you're not meant to know whether you're getting the antidepressant or the placebo tablet, but actually many people can guess what they're getting, because an antidepressant isn't just a placebo. It is an active drug. It is a drug that changes our brain chemistry and makes us feel a bit different. And so, and also can have physical side effects like getting a dry mouth or feeling nauseous. So people can often guess whether they're getting the real drug in these studies, which will give them a bit of a boost over the people who are getting the placebo. So the research actually doesn't tell us that these drugs are life-saving or are really significantly effective. And even if, and also I should say, it doesn't identify any particular group of people who might do better with these drugs either. Lots of people who are trying to defend antidepressants say, well, okay, overall they might not have very good effects, but they're good for some people, and maybe they're good for people with more severe depression. Actually, the evidence doesn't support that. It doesn't support. We've never identified a group of people who have a reasonable effect from an antidepressant, and we haven't shown that people with more severe depression have clinically significant benefits from taking antidepressants either. And the research certainly has never shown that the randomized controlled trial research, the sort of really robust and strong research, has not shown that these drugs reduce suicide or, reduce suicidal behavior or suicidal feelings. And in fact, overall, the randomized trials suggest that particularly in younger people, these drugs can sometimes make people feel suicidal. They can induce suicidal thoughts. And probably because in younger people in particular, they can sometimes stimulate a sort of artificial state of agitation, which can be really quite unpleasant. Sometimes it's referred to as akathisia. And it can make people do impulsive things and give people sort of preoccupying and intrusive thoughts, negative thoughts. The other thing that antidepressants do, so I just want to stress again, they are not placebos, they're not inactive. We have no evidence that they are correcting anything that's going on in the brain, because we have no evidence that there is any biological abnormality going on in the brains of people who are depressed or anxious or in any other emotionally unhappy state. But what we do know is that these are active drugs that change the normal state of our brain chemistry and our brain activity. And therefore, they will change our mental states and mental activity. And one of the changes that antidepressants seem to produce, and they produce this change in people who are emotionally distressed, but also in normal volunteers, people who don't have emotional problems, is that they cause this state of emotional numbing. They seem to dial down the intensity of emotions, both positive and negative emotions. And people very consistently report this effect from taking antidepressant drugs. They say, for example, they can't really feel happy anymore. They can't cry. And we also know that when people come off antidepressants, they often get into a very emotional state because they're having a sort of rebound effect, because the emotions have been suppressed by the drugs. When you come off them, they really rebound, and become more intense than they would even normally be. And that emotional suppression may, of course, be experienced as helpful by some people. Lots of people find it a very unpleasant state to be in, I should say. But some people who are very distressed may find it temporarily helpful to have their feelings suppressed for a bit. So that's another theoretical way in which antidepressants may be helpful for people in the short term. But in the long term, I think it's not useful to have your emotions suppressed, and actually can really inhibit people from making a full recovery, because it reduces people's motivation to try and work out why they're feeling as they are feeling and to do something about it.
Yeah, I think number one, thank you for sharing that, because that was so informative. But I there's so many things. So if antidepressants don't have that much more benefit than a placebo, but yet and still they're being pushed as the answer, let alone the side effects, and they're causing people to not feel positive and negative emotions, it almost seems like if you haven't been feeling your feelings, and then you get to a point where your body says, okay, we have to feel this because we can't suppress this anymore, and then you take something to suppress that, you feel better emotionally briefly because you're just not feeling. But then
Mm.
once you come off of it, you have this huge spike in all the things that were suppressed. Like, how is that doing any good?
Yeah, and I also think it, potentially can inhibit people from learning how to manage their emotions. If you and in fact, when I was training, and we did some psychotherapy training as part of our psychiatric training. The general position of psychotherapists was that they felt that you couldn't really do psychotherapy properly if you were on psychoactive medication that numbed or suppressed or sort of modified your emotions in some way. That you actually had to be able to experience your emotions in their raw, unaltered form in order to get through them and work out ways of managing them. And so psychotherapists would be very reluctant to take people who were taking benzodiazepine medication, or people who were drinking heavily, because recreational drugs also affect our emotions, and many of them suppress emotions or modify emotions in some way. And the trouble is that because antidepressants have not been regarded as having mind-changing effects, the fact that they modify our emotions has been ignored, and we've just not really acknowledged this issue. And giving out antidepressant to everyone is a bit like encouraging people to just drink their blues away. I'm not saying it's exactly the same, because of course alcohol has much more more marked and more and stronger mind changing effects and effects on our emotions and things, and the effects of antidepressants are much more subtle. But in principle, we are doing the same sort of thing. We're just drugging away people's emotions.
Because of what because you're a doctor and you have all of this experience and all this knowledge, and you've done all these studies that basically show antidepressants are very little value for people who need help emotionally. Do you ever feel like exposing that truth could put you in an unsafe position because of maybe you're taking money out of big pharma's pockets?
So, antidepressants have mostly come off patent, which means that the big pharmaceutical companies don't make money off them anymore. So I actually think I published my first major paper on antidepressants in 2005, and that was a time that there were still a few antidepressants on patent, but most of the big ones had come off patent by that time. And I think that's no coincidence. I don't think that a journal would have published it if the big antidepressants had still been on patent, because there are just very subtle ways in which the pharmaceutical industry can influence the medical publishing industry. And also at that time, medicine was so corrupt that there were, just so many payments and freebies being splashed around by the pharmaceutical industry, particularly in mental health. And journals were, taking a lot of money from the pharmaceutical industry. And it has cleaned up its act a bit, especially in the UK, also in the US. There's been more of a move to make doctors declare what they're receiving from pharmaceutical companies and things like that. So I think that one of the reasons why I've been able to say what I've been able to say is that a lot of pharmaceutical companies aren't that interested in antidepressants anymore. However, there is interest in a new drug for depression called esketamine, which is basically a version of ketamine, which is being marketed by the drug company Janssen. And I know that so esketamine was licensed by the FDA on the basis, and the FDA had to bend its own rules to license it because the evidence was so ropey and so weak. The FDA only require 2 positive studies. You can do 20 studies and 18 of them can be negative. But if you've got 2 positive studies, the FDA will license your drug as long as it's not killing people immediately. Esketamine, the makers of esketamine couldn't even produce 2 positive studies. So the FDA said, okay, we'll take 1 positive study because you've got 1, and then we'll let in one of these long-term relapse prevention studies, which we don't usually consider, and we'll consider that as evidence. So they licensed it on that basis. The UK regulator, the licensing body, licensed it, partly because they license most things that the FDA approve of. But the UK body called NICE, which is the body that decides whether something will be available for people on the NHS in the public health system and whether it will be reimbursed, didn't agree for esketamine to be publicly available because they didn't feel that the evidence was strong enough to prove that it was beneficial and that its benefits outweighed its harms. And the drug company clearly was very unhappy with this decision and appealed it once, got knocked back, and I expect is appealing it again. And I, together with several other colleagues, I was involved in putting in evidence to NICE because NICE asks for comments from various stakeholders. So I put in evidence that was critical of the evidence on esketamine and pointing out how weak it was and also how little data we had on its long-term consequences of taking it. And that's a much more live issue. and I haven't been aware of being targeted by that pharmaceutical company at all. But that feels like, that might be a potential source of trouble. Whereas, as I said, for most antidepressants, they're off patent, and I don't think the drug companies are actually interested in them anymore.
I think it's crazy that they allow 2 positive studies and there can be 18 negative. That is insane.
Yeah.
My God. You said before that informed consent is one of the most overlooked ethical failures in modern psychiatry. What would an honest, full, and humane consent process look like? And what would patients need to hear before being handed a prescription pad?
So first of all, people need to know that need to know that the idea that your mental health problem, your emotional distress is caused by something going on in your brain has not been scientifically proven. There is no compelling evidence that is the case. There is lots of evidence that emotional distress is a reaction to things, to life events. And so in my view, it's much more appropriate and also helpful to people to understand their emotional problems as reactions and to try and work out what they're reacting to, what it is in their life that might need to be changed. So first of all, people need to be given an honest explanation about the nature of mental health problems, and they should not be misled into believing that that we've shown that there's a biological origin to their emotional situation. And people need to be told that explicitly, because I think because there's been so much propaganda from the pharmaceutical industry and so much promotion of this idea that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance, for many people that will be their default understanding. So that needs to be unpicked, first of all. And then it needs to be explained that the drug treatments that are commonly given for these problems are not targeting under any underlying biological mechanism. They are chemicals that change the normal state of our brain chemistry. They haven't been very well investigated to the extent that we don't know exactly how they're changing our brain chemistry, and we don't know exactly what the consequences of doing that are. And we certainly don't have very good evidence about the consequences of taking these substances for long periods of time, which many people, of course, do. Many people start on antidepressants and then end up taking them for years and years. And there is very little data about the effects of that. And particularly some of the more unusual effects or unpredictable effects, which are coming to light, which have come to light recently, such as prolonged withdrawal effects that people can suffer from if they've if they've been on the medication for a long time and then tried to come off it, and prolonged sexual dysfunction. This is really, really important for people to know. One of the common adverse effects of antidepressants is sexual dysfunction. I think that is reasonably well known. I would hope that everyone who is offered an antidepressant or started on an antidepressant is informed about that. And I expect most people are. But what has come to light more recently is that some people will have persistent sexual dysfunction after they stop taking their antidepressant. And some studies have suggested that this might be as common as, happen as commonly as in 10% of people who take and then stop antidepressants. It's very difficult. There aren't many surveys of sexual problems because it's a difficult area to research, and people are obviously, reluctant to talk about it. But it certainly exists. There are lots of people reporting this effect now. It seems to be associated with the emotional numbing effect. It's particularly characterized by numbing of the genitals and as well as loss of libido, of desire generally. So, and then there are various other adverse effects that people need to be informed about, like an increased risk of bleeding and falls in elderly people and that sort of thing. Risks in pregnancy, very important that young women are informed about the potential risks of taking antidepressants in pregnancy. So people need to know all these things. They need to know, they need to understand that these common ideas about depression being caused by a biological mechanism have not been substantiated, and they are misleading. They need to know that antidepressants are not drugs that work by targeting some underlying mechanism. They are drugs that change our normal brain chemistry, and that we don't fully understand the consequences of doing that. And they need to know about the data that we have on established adverse effects.
Thank you for that so much. I think I want to ask you this question, and I want you to be perfectly honest. If you could tear down the psychiatric industry as it is now and rebuild it from the ground up, how would it look, and how involved would you be?
So that's a great question. So I think, well, what I would like to do first of all is locate mental health services, get them out of medical practice altogether, get them away from medical practice, and locate them, or most of them, the mental health services for people with emotional problems like depression and anxiety, I think should be located in social services or in somewhere where the emphasis is not on treating the disorder, going back to your one of your early questions, is not on treating this thing that people have, but on working out what the problems that the individual is facing consist of and how to help them. So it needs to be a place where people can access therapy, because therapy can be helpful for some people, but not necessarily for everyone, where they can access debt advice, financial advice, housing advice, employment advice, relationship counseling, where they can access all the services that might be helpful for the problems that they are having that have led to them feeling stressed, anxious, depressed, etc. So I think that's the main intervention, the main change that I would advocate. Now, there are people who have more severe mental health problems. So we might refer to them as psychosis. Some people have very severe depression. Sometimes they have psychotic symptoms as part of their depression. Some people take to bed and even stop eating or drinking. Their depression is that severe. And those people need looking after and caring for. And so I think there has to be some service that looks after people. And in some situations, I think that drug treatment can be helpful in that. For example, someone who's going through a manic phase, it's useful for them to have some sedatives to make sure that they sleep, that they, minimize the crazy things that they do when they're in that sort of situation. And then when they start to come down and normalize, they can be gradually weaned off them. So there also needs to be a service for people who are experiencing these, more severe and unusual forms of mental disorder, that can help support people, keep people safe, and that would involve the use of drug treatment. Now, who staffs those services is another question, and I would say that it doesn't necessarily need to be psychiatrists at all, but the people who staff those services need to have some medical knowledge, because, as I say, I think drug treatment is helpful in some circumstances, and people who are going to be administering drugs need to understand exactly what they're doing, and how to use them cautiously and safely. And actually, people need to have better knowledge than psychiatrists currently have, because psychiatry has been so focused on this idea that the drug treatment, focuses on a particular mechanism. It replenishes serotonin or it corrects some other imbalance. Psychiatrists and psychiatric researchers have not investigated the full range of the effects that the drugs that they prescribe actually produce. So there needs to be better research looking into the range of effects, and clinicians, whoever they are, whether they're psychiatrists or other people, need to have a better knowledge of that as well.
I agree wholeheartedly. And just taking somebody out of a bad situation can affect how they feel. And so if someone remains, like, let's say, for instance, they're in a household where maybe they suffer from abuse, if you remove them from that setting, their emotional state will automatically shift. And so I think it's so important what you said about making sure the focus is on the person and not just giving them drugs that would numb them out.
Yeah, I mean, the worst case scenario is that, you diagnose a mental disorder in someone, you treat them with drugs, and you are missing ongoing abuse.
Mm.
Because your model is so medically focused, you're focusing on their brain rather than them as a person and what's happening to them. I'm not saying that that happens a lot, or that obviously doctors would be horrified if they felt they were doing that, and would try their best not to let that happen. But what I'm saying is that our sort of medical model, our focus on our idea that these problems are in the brain, might lead us to do that.
Mm. For sure. All right, I got another personal question for you. When you think about your legacy, the legacy of your work, and not just the studies, but the ripple effect on how we understand human suffering, um, how do you want to be remembered most?
um, well, for empowering people to ask
Mm.
questions and to make their own minds up. I'm trying to put ideas out there that counteract the mainstream. I'm trying to show people the evidence that supports my ideas. But I recognize that people will come to their own conclusions, and that's fine. That's fine. That's great. But I just want people to have been exposed to the fact that there are different ways of looking at these problems. We don't have to go down this sort of very narrow medical route. There are other ways of understanding human suffering, and I suppose that just brings me to the other thing that upsets me about this whole sort of focus on the medical model. This whole idea that that we can locate suffering in the brain. It seems to me to take away from the trying to think of the right word that's not too corny, from the amazingness of being human, from the fact that
Right.
human beings are such creative, such diverse beings who do experience all these different feelings, that can go from intense joy and ecstasy to the depths of despair. That is what makes us interesting. And if we just pathologize that and say, oh no, that's not an interesting feature of being a human being, that's just some sort of abnormality in the brain, it seems to me that we're demeaning human nature.
I think that was the perfect word, and it wasn't corny by any means. So good choice. All right, last question for you. If you could use your platform to educate anyone who might be struggling with their mental or emotional health and might be uncertain of how or where to start, what would you say?
So I would say think about what I'd say. So I thought about this a lot when our serotonin paper was published, because people wrote to me saying, oh my goodness, I was told I had a chemical imbalance and you're telling me I haven't got one. What do I do now? And I could really, people were really upset. Of course they were upset. Many people had absorbed this idea, maybe against their better instincts. They'd probably gone to the doctor thinking, oh, there's probably nothing much wrong with me, and then being told they had a chemical imbalance and had to sort of readjust their whole outlook. And now I was coming along saying, no, that wasn't true. So what I think people need to do is think carefully about the evidence. If they're already taking antidepressants or considering taking them, or considering taking some other sort of drug treatment for their problems, to think about that very carefully and to really think through the pros and cons of doing so. It might be appealing to change your mental state because you're feeling so awful. And I completely get that. I completely get the temptation to do that. And maybe in the short term, that's fine. But just think very carefully about the long-term implications of doing that. And if you can, avoid getting on to, taking anything for long periods of time. So really think carefully about the pros and cons. Talk it through with your friends, your family. Have discussions about it. Take your time to make up your mind, and think things through. I think that's another way that, one of the ways in which therapy can be helpful. That it can give people that space to talk things through, to talk through different ways of understanding their distress and thinking through different options for helping themselves before they, plunge for taking medication or going down a sort of very medicalized route. So yes, really just, I think take your time, think through the options, think through the different ways of understanding it, talk to people, and don't rush into anything.
That was great advice. Thank you so much for pushing the envelope, for asking questions, because I feel like you've given so many people an opportunity to understand themselves. And maybe, like you said, they have gone against their better judgment, thinking there was nothing really wrong. And then they come home and they have, 5 different medications that they're supposed to take. And they don't know what to do, but they trust their doctor instead of trusting their intuition or their instinct. And I think your book is a light for that instinct that maybe people have turned off within themselves because they knew really what to do, but they just, kind of handed their power over to someone else. And so, chemically imbalanced, I think, is something that can help people come back to themselves and be whole again and understand, like, really what the truth is. So thank you for that. Thank you for the book. Thank you for your time. And thank you for being here with me today.
That's a pleasure. I've enjoyed it so much. Thank you for having me on.
If people want to find you online or find your book, where can they find it?
So I have a website, www.joannamoncrieff.com. I'm on X and B-Sky, and my book is coming out in the US on the 18th of September. So it will be available through Amazon US and other book retailers. And it's currently available on the UK site and through the publisher, which is Flint Books, another booksellers. And there's a electronic version of it as well that people can access if they want to.
Okay. Well, again, Dr. Moncrieff, thank you so much for this. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you do. And thank you for how you do it.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.